The Games of the 29th Olympiad will mark the turning point for China, the end of the transition from dormant dragon to global player. Or so the accepted wisdom goes. But as the US economic cloud grows ever darker, a shadow is also falling on the so-called Chinese miracle. I'm Taimur Nabili, and on this edition of 101 East, we ask, how serious are the challenges facing the global economy, and can China ride out a US recession? Manufacturing is at the heart of China's economic miracle. Factories, mostly funded by foreign investment and consumption, making a vast range of consumer goods for export and for domestic consumption. And so long as those factories keep selling and their workers keep consuming, all will be well. Melissa Chan went to find out how concerned China's workers are about economic conditions.
A lab at a research and development chemical manufacturing company. This isn't your stereotype image of manufacturing in China, with its assembly lines and hunched-over workers by the thousands. Here, there are specialists. Zhang Hang is a project manager at Pharmaron.
This company provides clients with the right chemicals for their pharmaceuticals. That means a lot of research and a special skill set in order to do my job.
He holds a degree in chemistry and is one of over 500 employees here, part of a new class of Chinese who work in manufacturing but who bring to the table much more than simple labor. Where he works is what China wants to see more of, the next step in its economic development from cheap manufacturing to high-tech innovations. China expects its economy to continue to grow this year, despite the U.S. economic slowdown. This means it won't be relying so much on its manufacturing sector, but the strength of the economy will depend on people like Mr. Zhang and his colleagues, skilled and professional Chinese, those with a good income who can ignore the currently high levels of inflation.
Various items definitely cost a lot more than in the past. Personally, however, inflation has only touched me a bit, not too much, and hasn't affected my habits.
This assumes the new consumer class in China will continue to buy unabated. But the question is whether there's enough people in this group to carry the weight of China's economy, and where the line is before this group starts feeling the grip of inflation.
At the moment, Chinese shoppers are continuing their spending spree, buying the latest gadgets, electronics. Inflation here has generally been felt in the price of food. And what does it matter to someone with the income to buy a computer or DVD player if the cost of pork or vegetables has doubled? So while hundreds of millions of the Chinese poor count their pennies and tighten their belts, there will be those who will not feel the growing pains of a developing economy. The luxury goods market in China, for example, is third in the world behind the United States and Japan. There are several 100,000 millionaires in this country. And even those outside the Millionaires Club, young Chinese professionals, save up to buy the handbag they've had their eye on, the brand name suit they've craved. But it's lonely at the top of the food chain, and the question is whether they too will eventually feel the effects of an economic slowdown.
Joining me in the studio today are Dr. Jim Walker, CEO and Chief Economist with Asianomics, and David Eldon, who's a former chairman with HSBC Asia Pacific. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let me begin by just positing a future question, and I want you to speculate about 2008. When we get to the new year, at the end of 2008, David, will the global economic situation be better, worse, or the same as it is now? Just as a general observation.
It's not going to be great, is probably the best I can do. If I really had a crystal ball, I'd be doing other things. But it's not going to be good. We haven't quite seen the last of the subprime issues, and I think there are more credit issues to come.
All right. In Asia, a lot of people are saying the problems are not so deeply entrenched, and the growth in this part of the world is still strong. Are we decoupled? Are we going to decouple?
It's certainly true that at the moment, Taimur, the growth is still strong. Asia looks good. But in the same way, even this time last year, US financial companies were not quite at the peak of their stock prices. Everybody thought everything was okay in the financial world in the US just a year ago. It takes time for the kind of economic shock waves to move. And what we'll find, I'm afraid, is second half of this year, Asia's main markets are going to be slowing down very sharply. Supply is going to continue to come on stream, in particular in places like China, just as demand is falling.
So in a way, Asia's economic growth is a bad thing because there's no markets for it to sell into at the end of this year.
This is really one of the problems. Asia has a lot of production just now. Whether at the end of the day it has final demand to take up that production, I think is a real question.
So having established that as our base scenario, then let's see how we get there from here. And David, I mean, I guess the credit crisis is still the sharp end of what's going on. The banking system right now is having a little bit of a soul-searching moment, isn't it?
It is.
That whole setup with the derivatives and the structured finance, how do you regard that?
You know, I think what is happening is that we've had a bit of a shock. I don't think people have actually got their arms completely around the shock, but I think as far as, let's say it all started with subprime, I think we've got to the stage now where we're sort of getting to understand how much is out there. If you take it in actual numbers, and Jim's the economist, I'm not, but if you take it in the numbers that I've seen, the amount of write-offs, and I'm talking write-offs, not write-downs, because there is a significant difference between the two, in US terms, probably looks at somewhere around 2% of their GDP. That's manageable. What nobody seems really to have focused on yet, although it's just beginning to happen, is what's going to happen to the credit cards and the receivables. We're now beginning to hear people say receivables are not coming in at the same rate that they were. People had been using their credit cards, I am sure, to top up their mortgage repayments. That stopped. They're now having trouble repaying their credit card loans. At least with the subprime, with the mortgages, you had a property behind it. Maybe not worth as much as it was when they first did it, but there was a property behind it. With credit cards, there's nothing behind it.
So, I mean, what you're saying is that the subprime, the clearing out of the junk, was all part of the normal process of business, but this is going to start getting into other areas.
This is where it's, I think starts to get serious.
Well, like what? I mean, what's the net result of that?
Well, I think David's exactly right. We're now, again, just moving to the next phase. We're beginning to see it coming through into credit cards. It's going to be into auto loans as well. I'm afraid what's really going to hit next in the US is commercial property. And I think that's really one of the frightening aspects of 2008. Nobody's talking about commercial property to any great extent at the moment. But the banks, over the course of the last number of years, were very good at getting residential mortgages off their books, spreading the risk of them. At the same time, they took on real estate loans through commercial property at a rate faster than ever. You'll find that the real estate loans in the US banking system are actually at almost record high levels, despite the fact that they don't have very many mortgages on the books. So there's a lot to come, Timur.
But all of this, of course, is, I mean, at the moment we're just talking about, I guess, numbers on a balance sheet, ideas in the air. I mean, what's the practical result of all of this? What is it going to mean for the man or woman on the street?
The main way to think about it is that as banks basically have to recapitalise, pull their horns in. What it means is that credit cannot be extended in the way that it has been over the last few years. It can't be used to create the derivatives, the securitisation that it has been over the last few years. And so we move into a period of probably credit contraction, certainly much, much slower credit growth. And what that means for everybody in the world is slower economic activity.
But I mean, in the US, a lot of people are talking about recession. The central bank is denying it. George Bush obviously is denying it. But are we seeing a recession, or perhaps worse, in the future?
I don't think we will get down to depression. The debate about recession, you're absolutely right. Well, for my money, I think the US is already in it. But there are a lot of people out there who are probably much better at this sort of thing than I am, saying not quite. But what's the difference between not quite and just in it?
Yeah. And we're only in February.
And we're only in February.
But your prognosis?
No, I think David's exactly right. We're in recession in the US.
But how bad will it get?
Well, I think it gets a lot worse than it is just now, and I think it stays down low for a lot longer than people would be anticipating, and that's really the result of the overhang of of all these structured products in the financial sector.
But, I mean, let me just quickly chuck a couple of examples at you. I mean, Michael Milken, the famous junk bond trader of a decade or so ago, 2 decades ago, he pretty much engineered the same scenario, created an enormous and ridiculous situation, went to jail for it, but it didn't crash the economy. And even the NASDAQ crash in the US of a few years ago, which was, you know, in many ways a very serious thing. None of these things created much more than a slight shallowing of economic growth. Why should this be any different?
Well, I think part of the reason that it's going to be a bit different this time is because of the way that the central bank acted to get out of the NASDAQ problem in particular. I mean, what the US central bank at that time did was obviously lower interest rates to 1%. They're going to do the same again. We'll be at 1.5 at least, or at most, by the end of this year. But what that does, of course, is pump up a bubble somewhere else, and basically that's what happened in the US housing market. The problem this time is that I can't, and I don't think a lot of other people can see where the next bubble is going to be. So they're going to lower interest rates. I'm afraid it's going to look, I think, very similar to Japan, lowering interest rates through the early 1990s. There's going to be no takers for the credit.
Yeah.
And that's the big difference.
And David, in Asia we had the 1997 crisis here, which was painful. Is this going to be as bad?
For Asia?
Yes.
That's an interesting question. I think it may be bad, but I don't think it's going to be as bad, perhaps, as the Americans are going to feel.
All right, well, let's leave it there. We're going to have to take a short break. We'll pause for just a few minutes. You're watching 101 East. Back in a moment.